Hello, dear students. We have discussed some terms. I hope that you might have understood these terms and tried to uh, understand more related things uh, which are associated, which are related with these terms. Now, here I will explain how the DNA copying is important for variation. How DNA copying is important for variation. And this DNA copying, it is DNA copying, it is in both types of reproduction. That means it is present in asexual reproduction as well as sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. And in asexual reproduction, the variation is less. Variation is less. Or you can say to some extent they are similar. Organisms reproduce through asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction are similar to each other. They are similar to each other, and you can say they are not very different. You cannot differentiate between them. And these but in case of sexual reproduction, the variation is more. Variation is more. Organisms reproduce through sexual reproduction through sexual reproduction are different from each other, that means they vary from each other. We can easily recognize, we can easily understand the different types of living organisms which are originated from the same living organism. For example, I will quote an example here. Organism which reproduces through asexual reproduction. If we have, for example, yeast, it is a yeast cell. It reproduces through budding and produces another yeast. It also reproduces through budding. And lot of yeasts are produced. And these yeasts, they reproduce asexually. These yeast cells, they have very less variation. We cannot understand that, or you can say these organisms, they have at least the genetic material is very, very similar. They are same. They have same genetic material. Variation is less. Why variation is less? I will explain you here. For example, here it is a yeast cell having DNA or like this, or chromosome. DNA or chromosome. I will explain it with the help of DNA. This, like this, it is a DNA. It is DNA. DNA. When the DNA gets copied, copying. When DNA is copying, that means another form of DNA is formed like this. It is a different process which you will study in higher classes, that how DNA gets copied. It is the parent DNA, and actually the DNA gets copied from it is strands, from it is two strands, because you might have heard about, in DNA there are four bases: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. And these four bases, they are abbreviated as AGTC. And there is a particular rule which these bases follow, that A always pairs with T with double bond, and G always pairs with C with triple bond. And these bases are present in the DNA. For example, the DNA like this. Here, if you know the bases in one strand AT, here G, you can easily guess what would be the bases in the next strand. That means G always pairs with C, that means here must be C. A always pairs with T, T always pairs with A, like this. These bases, they form the bases, they form the codes. They form the codes of the DNA. From these codes, they form the codes, and these codes are important for protein formation. And this protein formation is not easy. First, the DNA is converted into, or it is the DNA. First, DNA is converted into RNA, and then RNA into protein. But the base is DNA. When the DNA is copied, the copying of DNA is very high. If this is the DNA like this, here there are bases A, G, T, C, A. The copying, there are certain enzymes which are copying the DNA. They form another strand to its one original strand, and another new strand to its another strand, like this. If this is the DNA, for example, it is DNA. If this is the DNA, from this strand another DNA will be formed, from this strand another DNA will be formed. That means the base DNA, or the basic code of the DNA is followed. And these variations, because the new DNA is formed from this, there is a least chance of mistake. There occurs a mistake. But least chance of mistake is there. And this mistake in the DNA, it is known as mutation. What? Mutation. And these mutations are very less in asexual reproduction. That is why the organisms produced through asexual reproduction, they show least variation, they show least mutation, because DNA copying shows very less mistakes, and these mistakes appear as mutations, appear as variations in living organisms. Therefore, we cannot say that the organisms which reproduce through asexual reproduction, they do not have variation. They have variation, but the variation is very less. In case of these sexually reproducing organisms, what happens in these living organisms which reproduce sexually? We have sexual reproduction in which two types of genetic material combine from mother and father. When they combine, they form the zygote. That means two types of genetic information is present in the offspring. And when these two types of genetic material combine, first these sex cells, They are formed by a mechanism known as crossover mechanism. What is crossover mechanism? The chromosomes in mother's ovary, uh, cell or ova, they exchange their fragments and result into the exchange exchange of genetic material. And with the result, when these DNA gets exchanged, chromosomes gets exchanged, and variation occurs more and more. That means in case of sexual reproduction, what is the base of variation? You can mention crossing over of chromosomes in the sex cells. This crossing over, it is the result, it is the base of a lot of variation in their offsprings. Those organs which reproduce sexually, they have very large variation instead of these asexual reproducing organisms. And uh, in your textbook there is a question that how the sexual, or you can say asexual reproduction, how sexual reproduction have the advantage over, over the asexual reproduction, or you can say how the variation occurs in the living organisms. And I hope that you might have understood this, how DNA copying is important for this variation in living organisms. Thank you.